At 22 years old, Sadie Bennett thought she had lost everything. The grandmother who raised her was gone. Her brother inherited the fortune, and she was left with a ruined farmhouse nobody wanted. But hidden behind the walls of that forgotten house was a secret her grandmother had protected for decades. A secret that would change the life of a former orphan forever. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why the greatest inheritance isn't always the one worth the most money. If you enjoy heartfelt stories with powerful life lessons, subscribe and join us for more. The funeral was small. Just a handful of people gathered beneath a gray Kentucky sky, standing quietly among rows of weathered headstones as a cold October wind swept through the cemetery. A light drizzle fell from the clouds above, dampening black coats and umbrellas. Most people kept their eyes on the ground. Some whispered condolences. Others glanced at their watches, eager to return to their lives. But Sadie Bennett barely noticed any of it. At 22 years old, she stood alone near the back of the crowd. Her fingers curled tightly around the sleeves of an old wool coat she had bought from a thrift store 2 winters ago. She didn't cry. Not because she wasn't grieving, but because the pain sat too deep for tears. The woman being buried that morning wasn't just her grandmother. She had been her entire world. Ruth Bennett had entered Sadie's life when she was 10 years old. Before that, there had only been the orphanage. Long hallways painted in faded colors. Metal-framed beds lined up in rows. Birthdays that came and went unnoticed. And the heartbreak of watching other children leave with families while she remained behind. Sadie still remembered sitting by the window every Sunday afternoon, pretending to read while secretly watching the parking lot. Every car that pulled in sparked hope. Every car that drove away without her felt like another goodbye. As she grew older, she stopped asking when someone would choose her. Some disappointments become easier to survive when you stop expecting miracles. Then, one snowy December afternoon, a woman with silver hair and gentle eyes walked through the front doors carrying a tin of homemade cinnamon cookies. Her name was Ruth Bennett. Unlike the others, she didn't ask about grades. She didn't ask about behavior reports. She sat beside Sadie and asked what book she was reading. It was the first real conversation Sadie could remember having with an adult. And somehow, Ruth came back the next week. Then the week after that, and the week after that. Months later, when the adoption papers were finalized, Ruth knelt beside her and whispered words Sadie would never forget. "I didn't come here looking for a child. I came here looking for you." For the first time in her life, Sadie felt wanted. For the first time, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Now, Ruth was gone. As the minister finished his final prayer, the casket slowly disappeared beneath a blanket of white roses. A hollow ache spread through Sadie's chest. The same terrible feeling she had known as a little girl standing at orphanage windows. The feeling of being left behind. Only this time, it hurt even more, because there would be no one else coming back for her. No parents. No grandparents. No family. Just her older adoptive brother, Ethan Bennett, standing confidently beside the grave as relatives gathered around him. Ethan always seemed to belong wherever he went. People admired him, trusted him, praised him. Sadie had spent most of her life feeling invisible beside him. And as she watched him accept condolences with polished smiles and effortless charm, she couldn't shake the feeling that once the funeral ended, whatever fragile connection she still had to the Bennett family might disappear forever. She didn't know it yet, but Ruth Bennett had spent years preparing for this moment. And hidden far beyond the rolling hills of Cedar Ridge stood an old ruined farmhouse that carried a secret capable of changing Sadie's life forever. A secret far more valuable than any fortune. 2 days after the funeral, Sadie Bennett found herself sitting in a law office that looked as though it hadn't changed since the 1970s. The room smelled faintly of old paper, dust, and stale coffee. A small fan rattled in the corner, struggling against the humid Kentucky afternoon. Yellowed blinds filtered sunlight across worn wooden floors, and somewhere beyond the wall, an ancient clock ticked steadily. Sadie sat quietly in a cracked leather chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across from her sat Ethan Bennett. Unlike Sadie, Ethan looked completely at ease. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly. His expensive watch gleamed whenever he moved his wrist. One ankle rested casually on the opposite knee as he scrolled through emails on his phone. Every now and then, someone passing the office door would recognize him and wave. Ethan always had that effect on people. The lawyer, Mr. Whitaker, adjusted his glasses and opened a thick folder. "Thank you both for coming." Neither sibling answered. The silence stretched between them. Sadie couldn't remember the last time they had spoken without Ruth being present. Maybe years. The old lawyer cleared his throat. "As you know, your grandmother, Ruth Bennett, finalized her estate several years ago. She updated certain provisions shortly before her passing." Ethan nodded confidently, almost expectantly. Sadie noticed it immediately. He already believed he knew how this meeting would end. And honestly, so did she. After all, Ethan had always been the successful one, the admired one, the one people talked about with pride. He owned a thriving real estate company in Nashville. He drove luxury cars. He lived in a beautiful home overlooking a lake. Meanwhile, Sadie worked long shifts at a diner outside Lexington. She rented a tiny apartment above a laundromat. Her savings account barely covered 2 months of expenses. Life had never given her much. She certainly wasn't expecting it to start now. Mr. Whitaker began reading. There are several personal gifts and charitable donations outlined in the will. The first few minutes passed uneventfully. A collection of antique jewelry went to distant relatives. Several donations were made to local charities. A small amount of money was left to the church Ruth had attended for decades. Then the lawyer turned another page. "And to my grandson, Ethan Bennett." A smile slowly spread across Ethan's face. "I leave my residence located at Lake Hollow Drive, including all furnishings, vehicles, investment accounts, and associated financial assets." Ethan leaned back in his chair. There it is. The confirmation he had expected. The lake house alone was worth well over $1 million. The investments likely added several $100,000 more. Mr. Whitaker continued reading figures, numbers that made Sadie's stomach tighten. Not because she was jealous, but because they confirmed what she had always suspected. Ruth had loved them both. Yet Ethan had always belonged in a world of success and opportunity. A world Sadie had never quite managed to enter. Ethan glanced toward her. "Grandma always loved that place." His voice was casual, almost cheerful. Sadie forced a small smile. "She did." The lawyer turned another page. "And to my granddaughter, Sadie Bennett." For the first time, Sadie looked up. "I leave the property located at 148 Willow Creek Road, Cedar Ridge, Kentucky, including all structures, land, and contents therein." Silence. Then Ethan laughed. Actually laughed. The sound echoed through the office. "You're kidding." "Mr. Whitaker lowered his glasses. "Ethan." "But that's the old farmhouse." The lawyer said nothing. Ethan shook his head. "I thought that place got condemned years ago." Sadie felt heat rise to her face. She vaguely remembered hearing Ruth mention the property once or twice over the years. A farm somewhere in the hills. A place nobody visited anymore. A place nobody seemed to want. Mr. Whitaker slid a manila envelope across the desk. Inside were documents, property deeds, a faded map, and a ring of old brass keys. The lawyer's expression softened. Your grandmother specifically instructed that these be handed directly to you. Sadie stared at the envelope. Something about it felt strangely personal, as though Ruth had expected this exact moment, as though she had prepared for it. Ethan, however, looked thoroughly amused. Well, congratulations. His grin widened. You officially own a collapsing farmhouse. Sadie said nothing. Maybe you can sell it for scrap lumber. Still nothing. I'll tell you what, Ethan continued. If you find any ghosts up there, give me a call. Mr. Whitaker's jaw tightened. Ethan, enough. But Ethan was already standing. He buttoned his jacket and checked his watch. Anyway, I have a flight to catch. He turned toward Sadie. For a brief moment, something almost sympathetic crossed his face. Almost, if the roof falls in, let me know. Then he walked out. Just like that. The office door closed behind him, and the silence returned. Sadie stared at the envelope. The keys. The map. The old property deed. Something felt unfinished. Mr. Whitaker. Yes. Why would she leave me that house? The old lawyer hesitated. Long enough to make her heart beat faster. Finally, he smiled. A better question might be. He tapped the envelope gently. Why did she make certain nobody else received it? Before Sadie could ask what he meant, he simply stood and gathered his papers. The meeting was over. That evening, Sadie returned to her apartment. The building looked even sadder than usual. The hallway lights flickered. The air conditioner barely worked. And waiting beneath her door was another envelope. This one from the diner. Her stomach dropped before she even opened it. Budget reductions. Staff cuts. Effective immediately. Her position had been eliminated. She stood motionless in the kitchen for nearly an hour. The letter in one hand. Ruth's envelope in the other. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, the refrigerator hummed. That was the only sound. At 22 years old, Sadie Bennett had no job, no savings, no family left, no plan. Only a set of keys to a ruined farmhouse nobody seemed to want. Around midnight, she opened the envelope again. This time she unfolded the old map. Her eyes followed the winding roads leading deep into the hills outside Cedar Ridge. Then something slipped from between the papers. A photograph. Old and faded. The edges worn with age. In the picture, a little girl stood beside Ruth Bennett on the porch of an old farmhouse. The girl's hair was messy. Her smile was enormous, and her small hand was wrapped tightly around Ruth's. Sadie's breath caught. It was her. The summer after her adoption. On the back of the photograph, written in Ruth's careful handwriting, were 7 simple words. Someday, this place will bring you home. A tear finally escaped down Sadie's cheek, and for the first time since the funeral, she cried. The next morning, she packed everything she owned into 2 duffel bags. By sunset, she was on a bus headed toward Cedar Ridge, toward the forgotten farmhouse, toward the future Ruth Bennett had chosen for her, even if she couldn't yet understand why. The bus dropped Sadie Bennett off just before sunset. The station wasn't really a station at all. Just a cracked stretch of pavement beside an old convenience store with a faded Coca-Cola sign hanging crooked above the door. When the bus pulled away, the silence settled around her almost immediately. No traffic, no sirens, no crowds, only the distant sound of wind moving through trees. Sadie adjusted the straps of her duffel bags and looked down at the folded map Ruth had left behind. According to the directions, the farmhouse sat nearly 3 miles outside Cedar Ridge, at the end of an old county road that barely appeared on modern maps. She started walking. The farther she traveled, the quieter the world became. The small town disappeared behind her. Telephone poles became less frequent. The road narrowed. Tall pines stretched toward the evening sky, their branches swaying gently overhead. By the time she reached the final bend, dusk had begun to settle across the hills, and then she saw it. The farmhouse. Sadie stopped walking. For several long seconds, she simply stared. Ethan hadn't exaggerated. The place looked exhausted. White paint had peeled away decades ago, exposing weather-beaten wood beneath. Part of the front porch sagged noticeably. Several windows were broken. Vines crawled up the exterior walls like nature had been slowly reclaiming the building for years. The barn behind the house leaned slightly to one side. Even the mailbox appeared tired. A rusty metal box hanging from a post that looked ready to collapse. For a moment, Sadie wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Maybe Ethan had been right. Maybe this really was nothing more than a forgotten piece of property waiting to fall apart. The evening breeze rustled through the grass. And yet, something about the house pulled at her. Not because it was beautiful, because it wasn't. Not because it looked valuable, because it certainly didn't. It felt familiar, like seeing the face of someone you hadn't thought about in years. She walked slowly toward the porch. The old wooden steps groaned beneath her weight. Her fingers trembled slightly as she selected one of the brass keys from the ring Ruth had left her. The lock resisted at first. Then, with a deep, metallic click, it finally turned. The front door creaked open. A rush of cool air spilled out. Dust, old wood, faded memories. The scent hit her immediately. Not unpleasant, not rotten, just old, as though time itself had been trapped inside for years. Sadie stepped across the threshold. The floorboards creaked beneath her boots. Sunlight filtered through dirty windows, casting long golden beams across the room. Furniture sat covered beneath white sheets. An old grandfather clock stood silent in the corner. A stone fireplace stretched across one wall. Dust danced lazily through the fading light. Everything was still, painfully still, as though the house had been holding its breath, waiting. She set her bags down and slowly wandered from room to room. The kitchen looked frozen in time. An old kettle still rested on the stove. Faded curtains hung beside the sink. A collection of antique plates sat neatly arranged inside a wooden cabinet. Nothing appeared abandoned, only untouched, as though someone had planned to return, but never did. Hours passed. Darkness settled outside. Eventually, Sadie found several oil lamps stored inside a pantry closet. After some trial and error, she managed to light one. A warm, golden glow filled the room. The shadows softened. For the first time since arriving, the farmhouse felt less lonely. That night, she slept on an old couch in the parlor beneath 2 handmade quilts she discovered inside a cedar chest. The wind whispered softly outside. Floorboards creaked occasionally. The house seemed alive in its own strange way. Not frightening, comforting, like an elderly relative settling into a rocking chair. For the first time in weeks, Sadie slept deeply. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows. She spent the day cleaning, opening curtains, sweeping dust, removing old sheets from furniture. Little by little, the farmhouse began revealing itself, and so did its memories. Photographs, letters, books, pieces of Ruth's life she had never seen before. By late afternoon on the second day, Sadie found herself dusting shelves inside what had once been a study. Most of the books were old. History, poetry, farming manuals, family Bibles. As she pulled one particularly large volume from the shelf, something slipped loose behind it, a folded piece of yellowed paper. She picked it up carefully. At first glance, it looked like an old sketch. Then her eyes widened. It was a floor plan, a hand-drawn map of the farmhouse. Every room appeared exactly where it should. The kitchen, the bedrooms, the study, the parlor. But there was one problem. One room shown on the map didn't exist. A small rectangular space behind the pantry. A room she had never seen. A room that shouldn't have been there. Her pulse quickened. She unfolded the paper completely. In the corner, written in faded handwriting, was a single sentence. For the one who chooses to stay, Sadie's heart skipped. Ruth. It had to be Ruth. She hurried downstairs. The pantry looked exactly as it had before. Shelves. Boxes. Old jars. Nothing unusual. But now she examined the walls more carefully, running her fingers along the wooden paneling. Listening, feeling. Then she noticed it. A faint draft. Cool air slipping through a narrow crack between two boards. Her breath caught. She pressed harder. The wood shifted slightly. Not much. It's just enough. Excitement surged through her chest. She found an old screwdriver in a kitchen drawer and returned moments later. The panel resisted, then groaned, then finally moved. Dust exploded into the air. A narrow opening appeared. Darkness waited beyond it. Sadie's heart pounded so loudly she could hear it. For a moment she hesitated. Then she grabbed the oil lamp and crawled through. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for her shoulders. The air felt dry. Still, undisturbed. After several feet, the space widened. Sadie slowly rose to her feet, then lifted the lamp higher, and froze. Books, hundreds of them. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined every wall. Leather-bound journals. Boxes of letters tied with ribbon. Photographs. Documents. Handwritten manuscripts. The room looked untouched by time, as though someone had carefully sealed away an entire world, waiting for decades, waiting for her. In the center stood a wooden desk, and resting upon it was a single journal, open, as though someone had just stepped away moments ago. With trembling hands, Sadie approached. The first page contained a familiar signature. Not Ruth Bennett. Someone older. Someone she had never met. Clara Bennett. Sadie's knees nearly gave out beneath her. She sank into the chair, her eyes filling with tears. At that moment, she finally understood. Ruth had never given her a ruined farmhouse. She had given her something far greater, a legacy. And hidden within these walls was a story waiting to change her life forever. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Every morning, Sadie woke to the sounds of the farmhouse stretching itself awake. The soft creak of old floorboards. The whisper of wind brushing against the porch. Birds calling from the trees beyond the fields. There was no alarm clock. No traffic outside her window. No rush to be anywhere. And for the first time in years, she found that she didn't mind. She would make coffee in the old kitchen, carrying a steaming mug onto the front porch while the morning fog drifted across the hills. Then, almost without thinking, she would find herself drawn back to the hidden room, back to the place Ruth had somehow known she would discover, back to the stories waiting beneath decades of silence. At first, Sadie simply read. Hours would disappear as she sat at the wooden desk turning fragile pages beneath the glow of an oil lamp. The journals belonged to generations of Bennett women, women whose names had never appeared in history books, Women nobody outside Cedar Ridge would ever know. Yet their lives filled shelf after shelf. There was Clara Bennett, who had arrived in Kentucky as a 16-year-old bride shortly after the Civil War. There was Margaret Bennett, who delivered babies throughout the county during a deadly influenza outbreak. There was Eleanor Bennett, who taught children to read in a one-room schoolhouse for nearly 40 years. Each woman had left pieces of herself behind. Letters, recipes, stories, heartbreaks, dreams, and somehow, as Sadie read their words, they no longer felt like strangers. They felt like family. One rainy evening, she opened a journal dated 1918. The pages were worn thin with age, the handwriting delicate but steady. She read aloud quietly. The snow came early this year. We lost 3 neighbors before Christmas. The roads were impossible, but Mrs. Walker went into labor during the storm. I walked 4 miles carrying my medical bag and a lantern. By the grace of God, both mother and child survived. Sadie stopped reading. Her throat tightened. She looked around the room, at the shelves, at the journals, at the lives preserved inside them. These women hadn't been famous. They hadn't been wealthy. Most had spent their lives unnoticed. Yet they had carried entire communities through hardship. They had healed people, fed people, comforted people, saved people, and almost nobody remembered their names. Until now. A strange feeling began growing inside Sadie, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Pride. Not in herself, not yet, but in where she belonged. Because for most of her life, Sadie had believed she was an outsider. The orphan nobody wanted. The adopted daughter who never quite fit. The quiet girl standing on the edge of every family photograph. But sitting in that room, surrounded by generations of stories, she began to see something differently. Family wasn't only about blood. It was about choosing, and every page she turned reminded her that Ruth had chosen her, not by accident, not out of pity, but intentionally. One afternoon, while organizing a stack of documents, Sadie discovered another surprise. A brass key taped beneath a wooden drawer. Attached to it was a small note written in Ruth's familiar handwriting. "When you're ready, open the cellar." Her heart skipped. The cellar. She remembered seeing a locked door outside the kitchen. She had assumed it contained little more than storage. Now she wasn't so sure. The key fit perfectly. The old lock clicked open with surprising ease. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. Sadie grabbed a lantern and carefully made her way down. The cellar was larger than she expected. Stone walls, wooden shelves, crates stacked neatly in corners, everything organized with remarkable care. Then she saw it. A large iron safe tucked against the far wall. Its black metal surface gleamed beneath years of dust. She stared at it. Ruth had hidden a room. What else had she hidden? Slowly, Sadie approached. There was no keyhole, only a combination dial. She smiled sadly. Typical Ruth, always leaving puzzles behind. For nearly 20 minutes she tried different numbers. Birthdays, anniversaries, important dates, nothing. Then a thought appeared. Not a date, a number. The room where they first met, at the orphanage, room 12. Her fingers trembled. She turned the dial. The mechanism clicked. Sadie froze. Then the safe door slowly swung open. Inside were several photo albums, bundles of letters tied with ribbon, a small wooden box, and one sealed envelope. Across the front, written in Ruth's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 simple words. For my Sadie. The room suddenly felt very still, very quiet. She carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. The paper shook slightly in her hands as she began reading. "My dearest Sadie, if you are reading this, then you found the room. I always believed you would. By now, you've probably spent your whole life wondering why certain things happened the way they did, why you were left behind, why life seemed easier for everyone else. I wish I could answer every question. But there is one thing you must know. You were never unwanted. Not for a single day. The first time I saw you sitting by that orphanage window, pretending not to cry, I saw more courage in a 10-year-old girl than most people show in a lifetime. I didn't choose you because you needed a family. I chose you because I needed you. This house, these stories, this legacy, they were never meant for the person with the most money. They were meant for the person who would listen. And you have always listened. Promise me something, Sadie. Don't spend your life wondering whether you belong. You always have. Love forever. Grandma Ruth." By the time Sadie reached the end, tears blurred the page. She pressed the letter against her chest and closed her eyes. For years, she had carried a wound she couldn't explain. A belief that somehow she had been less wanted, less chosen, less worthy. And now, with a few pages of ink and paper, Ruth had shattered that lie. The farmhouse suddenly looked different. The hidden room looked different. Even her future looked different. This wasn't an abandoned property. It wasn't charity. It wasn't the leftover piece Ethan didn't want. It was trust. It was purpose. It was love, carefully preserved and passed from one generation to the next. That night, Sadie sat alone in the hidden library long after darkness covered the hills of Cedar Ridge. The journals surrounded her. The letter rested beside her. And for the first time since Ruth's funeral, she no longer felt abandoned. She felt chosen. And deep inside, something new began to take root. Not grief, not loneliness, but responsibility, because she was beginning to understand why Ruth had left her the farmhouse, and why the greatest inheritance had never been money at all. The idea didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly, like sunlight slipping through a curtain, like a voice carried on the wind, like something that had been waiting patiently for Sadie to become ready enough to hear it. For nearly 3 weeks, she remained at the farmhouse. Each morning she cleaned another room. Each afternoon she read another journal. Each evening she sat on the porch watching the sun disappear behind the hills while Ruth's letter rested folded inside her coat pocket. The house no longer felt abandoned. It felt alive. And so did she. One afternoon, while reading through Clara Bennett's journals, Sadie found herself pausing over a particular entry. The page was dated 1891. The handwriting was elegant but hurried. If these stories are ever forgotten, then we disappear twice, once in life and once in memory. Sadie read the sentence again and again. Something about those words settled deep inside her heart, because suddenly she wasn't thinking about the women whose journals lined the shelves. She was thinking about children. Children like the girl she used to be, the lonely ones, the forgotten ones, the ones who grew up believing their stories didn't matter. She remembered sitting in the orphanage library after everyone else had gone to bed, reading books beneath a flashlight hidden under her blanket, escaping into stories because real life felt too painful. Books had saved her. Stories had saved her. And now she was sitting inside a house filled with stories nobody knew existed. That was when the thought first appeared. What if this place wasn't meant to stay hidden? Sadie sat very still. The idea frightened her. The hidden library had survived because Ruth protected it, because generations of Bennett women protected it. Who was she to decide its future? But another question followed. Who was she not to? That evening she barely slept. By sunrise, She knew she needed help. Real help. Someone who understood history. Someone who could tell her whether what she had found truly mattered. She dug through an old box of belongings she had brought from Lexington and found a college notebook from years earlier. Inside was an email address she hadn't used in almost 3 years. Lucas Parker, a graduate student she had met during a community history workshop. Back then, Lucas had been the kind of person who became excited over old photographs and forgotten family records. Sadie remembered teasing him about it. Now she hoped he still felt the same way. She sent a message, a short one. "I found something unusual. I think you should see it." She wasn't expecting a quick response. Instead, her phone rang less than 30 minutes later. Sadie. His voice sounded exactly the same. Warm, curious, slightly breathless. "Lucas, you said unusual." There was a pause. "How unusual?" Sadie looked toward the hidden room, toward the shelves, toward the journals. "How do you feel about a century of family history hidden behind a wall?" Silence. Then, "I'm getting in my truck." 2 days later, Lucas arrived. The moment he stepped onto the porch, Sadie almost laughed. Some things never changed. His shirt was wrinkled. His glasses were slightly crooked, and he carried 3 notebooks under one arm. "Tell me you're not exaggerating." "I wish I was." She led him through the house, past the kitchen, past the pantry, through the hidden doorway. Then she watched his expression change. First curiosity, then surprise, then complete disbelief. Lucas stopped moving. For nearly a full minute, the room was silent. Finally, he whispered, "Oh my God." He moved slowly through the shelves, running his fingers along book spines, examining handwritten journals, carefully opening boxes of letters. His excitement grew with every step. By evening, dozens of books lay spread across the table. Lucas looked overwhelmed. The good kind. The kind historians dream about. "Sadie." "What?" He shook his head. "I don't think you understand what this is." She smiled. "I was afraid you'd say that." "No, seriously." His voice dropped. "This isn't just family history." He picked up one of Clara's journals, then another, then a collection of letters. These are first-hand accounts spanning generations. He looked around the room. "This is a historical archive." Sadie stared at him. "A what?" "A treasure." The word hung in the air. Treasure. Not money, not gold, not diamonds. Something better. Something that lasted. Lucas spent the next 3 days documenting everything. Cataloging names. Dating documents. Photographing fragile pages. And the more he discovered, the more excited he became. One evening, they sat together on the porch as fireflies drifted across the fields. Lucas broke the silence. "You know people need to see this." Sadie stared toward the darkening hills. "I've been thinking the same thing. You could partner with universities. Maybe museums." She shook her head. "No." Lucas looked surprised. "No." Sadie smiled softly. "No." Her gaze moved toward the farmhouse, toward Ruth's house, toward the place that had changed her life. "I don't want to send these stories away." Lucas understood immediately. His expression softened. "You want people to come here?" She nodded. Ruth protected this place for a reason. The porch fell quiet. Then Lucas smiled. "I think she'd like that." The following week, something remarkable happened. Sadie received an email from the director of the orphanage where she had spent her childhood. Willow Creek Children's Home. At first, she assumed it was a fundraising request. Instead, It was something entirely different. The director had heard about the historical discovery through Lucas, and she had a question. Would Sadie be willing to host a small group of teenage girls from the orphanage? Just one visit, just one afternoon, to see the house, to hear the stories. Sadie read the email 3 times. Then she looked around the kitchen, the old floors, the restored furniture, the photographs, the journals, and suddenly she knew. This was it. This was why Ruth had chosen her. Not simply to preserve the past, but to share it, to give hope to people who needed it. Just as Ruth had once given hope to a lonely little girl sitting by a window, that evening Sadie walked out to the neglected garden behind the farmhouse. The ground was overgrown with weeds. Years of neglect covered everything. Yet beneath the weeds, life still waited. She knelt in the dirt, pulled away the first handful of dead roots, then another, and another. The setting sun painted the hills gold. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. For the first time in years, Sadie wasn't wondering what would happen next. She wasn't afraid of tomorrow. She wasn't trying to survive. She was building something. Something Ruth had seen long before she ever could. And somewhere deep inside, she felt it. The farmhouse was no longer waiting. It had begun becoming exactly what it was always meant to be. And so had she. Change did not arrive in a single moment. It wasn't dramatic. There was no grand speech, no miraculous breakthrough. Instead, it happened the same way spring arrives after a hard winter. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, until one day, everything looks different. By early summer, Sadie Bennett barely recognized the woman she had been when she first arrived at the farmhouse. The frightened girl who stepped off that bus carrying 2 duffel bags and a broken heart felt like someone from another lifetime. Back then, she had been surviving. Now, she was living. The house reflected that change. Every week brought another improvement. A repaired window, a freshly painted wall, a porch board replaced, a garden bed restored. The work was exhausting. Her hands were often blistered. Her back ached most evenings. Yet she found herself smiling more than she had in years. Because every nail she hammered and every room she cleaned felt like a promise being fulfilled. Not only to Ruth, but to herself. For the first time in her life, Sadie wasn't waiting for someone else to rescue her. She was building her own future. And that realization changed everything. Meanwhile, Lucas continued helping organize the archive. What began as a collection of forgotten journals slowly transformed into something much larger. Graduate students arrived from universities across Kentucky and Tennessee. Historians volunteered their time. Archivists helped preserve fragile documents. The hidden room that had remained silent for generations was finally beginning to speak. And people were listening. At first, Sadie felt uncomfortable around scholars and researchers. Most had advanced degrees. Many had spent their entire careers studying history. She worried they would see her as an outsider, just a former orphan who happened to inherit a house. But something unexpected happened. Whenever visitors had questions, they naturally turned toward her. Not Lucas. Not the professors. Her. Because nobody knew the stories like she did. She had spent months living among them, reading every journal, every letter, every diary entry. The women whose names filled those shelves had become part of her life. And when Sadie spoke about them, people listened. One afternoon, a university researcher asked her a simple question. What made you decide to stay? The room grew quiet. Several people looked up from their work. Sadie thought for a moment, then smiled. I didn't stay because of the house. Everyone waited. I stayed because it was the first place that ever made me feel like I belonged. The answer spread through the room like a gentle wave. And for the first time, Sadie realized something important. She wasn't merely protecting a legacy anymore. She had become part of it. The first group of girls from Willow Creek Children's Home arrived in late June. 10 teenagers stepped nervously from a small bus. Sadie recognized the look in their eyes immediately, because she had worn that same expression herself. The careful distance, the guarded hope, the fear of disappointment. Children who spend years in the system learn not to expect too much. A hope can hurt. Sadie knew that better than anyone. She greeted each girl personally, learning names, offering smiles, making sure nobody felt invisible. Inside the farmhouse, she showed them the restored rooms, the photographs, the journals, the garden. At first, the girls were polite but reserved. Then Sadie opened the hidden library. Everything changed. She watched their eyes widen, watched curiosity replace uncertainty, watched wonder replace caution. One girl stood staring at a journal for nearly 5 minutes. Another carefully traced the edge of a century-old photograph. They weren't just looking at history. They were seeing proof that ordinary people mattered, that forgotten people mattered, that their own stories mattered. Later that afternoon, Sadie gathered them around a large wooden table. She held one of Clara Bennett's journals in her hands. Then she began reading. The room became completely silent. The girls listened as Clara wrote about hardship, loss, courage, perseverance, dreams that survived despite impossible odds. When Sadie finished, nobody spoke immediately. Finally, a small voice came from the far end of the table. A girl named Emma, 14 years old, shy, quiet, the kind of child who tried not to draw attention to herself. "Do you think—" Emma hesitated, then tried again. "Do you think somebody will remember our stories one day?" The question hit Sadie like a punch to the heart, because it was the exact question she had carried for most of her life. Will anyone remember me? Will I matter? Will anyone care that I was here? For a moment, she couldn't speak. Then she walked over and gently squeezed Emma's shoulder. "I think your story matters right now." The girl blinked rapidly, trying not to cry. Several others were doing the same. And suddenly Sadie understood something Ruth had known all along. The archive wasn't about the past. Not really. It was about the future. The women whose journals filled those shelves were reaching forward through time, helping new generations believe in themselves, giving courage to people they would never meet, the same way Ruth had given courage to her. That evening, after the girls returned to the orphanage, Sadie stood alone in the garden. The sun was setting behind the hills. Golden light stretched across rows of newly planted herbs. Lavender, mint, rosemary, plants Ruth had once grown herself. The air smelled of earth and summer. For a long time, Sadie simply stood there, listening, not to voices, not to ghosts, but to something deeper. The feeling that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Months earlier, she had arrived believing she had lost everything. Her family, her job, her direction, her future. But now she could finally see the truth. Ruth hadn't left her a burden. She had left her a purpose. And purpose was worth more than any fortune Ethan had inherited. As darkness settled over Cedar Ridge, Sadie looked toward the farmhouse glowing warmly beneath the evening sky. The windows no longer looked abandoned. The porch no longer sagged with loneliness. The house felt alive, loved, needed, just like her. And for the first time in her life, Sadie Bennett no longer wondered whether she belonged. She knew she did, because the farmhouse had claimed her, and she had finally claimed herself. A year later, Almost everything had changed. And yet, somehow, the most important things had stayed exactly the same. The farmhouse still stood at the end of the winding dirt road. The hills still rolled endlessly beyond the fields. The wind still carried the scent of pine trees through the valley every evening. But the silence that once surrounded the property was gone. Life had returned. On a warm September morning, Sadie Bennett stepped onto the front porch with a cup of coffee cradled between her hands. The sunrise painted the hills gold. Dew shimmered across the grass, and somewhere beyond the garden she could hear laughter. Real laughter, the kind that echoed, the kind that stayed with the place. She smiled. A group of girls from Willow Creek was already gathering beneath the old oak tree beside the barn. Some were writing in notebooks. Others were reading journals copied from the archive. A few simply sat together talking. A year ago, Sadie would never have imagined this. Back then, she had arrived carrying grief. Now she was surrounded by purpose. The hidden library was no longer a secret. With the help of historians, volunteers, and preservation specialists, the collection had been officially recognized as the Ruth Bennett Legacy Archive. Researchers visited throughout the year. Teachers brought students. Authors traveled hundreds of miles to study the journals. Several universities had offered enormous sums of money to purchase portions of the collection. Sadie refused every offer, not because she didn't need the money. She certainly did. The farmhouse still required repairs. Grants were difficult to secure. Every month seemed to bring a new expense. But some things weren't meant to be sold. The stories belonged here. This was where they had lived. This was where they had survived. And this was where future generations would discover them. One afternoon, a documentary crew arrived from Nashville. They wanted to film a feature about the archive and the remarkable discovery hidden inside the old farmhouse. At first, Sadie almost said no. She had never enjoyed attention. For most of her life, she had done everything possible to avoid standing in the spotlight. But Lucas convinced her. People need to hear this story. It's not my story. Lucas smiled. It is now. For 3 days. Cameras followed visitors through the house. They filmed the archive, the gardens, the workshops, the writing programs for foster children and orphans. But the moment that affected Sadie most happened unexpectedly. The producer was interviewing several teenage girls who had visited the farmhouse throughout the year. One by one, they shared what the experience had meant to them. Then a familiar face appeared on camera. Emma, the shy 14-year-old who had once asked whether anyone would remember her story. She looked nervous, but determined. The producer asked a simple question. What did you learn here? Emma thought for a moment, then answered quietly. I learned that ordinary people matter. The room fell silent. The girl continued. When I first came here, I thought history was about famous people. She glanced toward the archive. Now I know it's also about people like us. Her voice trembled slightly. The women in those journals weren't rich. They weren't celebrities. But somebody took the time to save their stories. A tear slipped down her cheek. And if their stories matter... She paused. Maybe mine does too. The camera crew stopped speaking. Several people wiped away tears. Sadie couldn't move, because in that moment she wasn't hearing Emma. She was hearing herself. The little girl sitting alone beside an orphanage window. The little girl who spent years wondering whether anyone would ever choose her, whether anyone would remember her, whether her life mattered. Ruth had answered those questions long ago. Now, Sadie was helping answer them for others. That evening, after everyone had gone home, she sat alone on the porch swing. The same swing Ruth had loved. The sky above Cedar Ridge glowed with stars. A soft breeze moved through the fields, and for the first time in months, She allowed herself to simply be still. No projects, no meetings, no responsibilities, just gratitude. Her phone rang. The caller ID surprised her. Ethan. For a moment, she considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, she answered, "Hello." There was a pause. Then her brother spoke. His voice sounded different, quieter, older somehow. "I saw the documentary." Sadie smiled faintly. "Yeah?" Another pause. "It was good." She waited. Ethan cleared his throat. "I don't think I understood before." Sadie looked toward the farmhouse, toward the lights glowing softly inside, toward the life that now filled every corner. "No," she said gently. "I guess you didn't. I thought Grandma gave me the better inheritance." His laugh was small and sad. "Turns out I was wrong." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan said something she never expected to hear. "I'm proud of you, Sadie." Tears immediately filled her eyes. Not because she needed his approval. She didn't. Not anymore. But because for the first time, she heard sincerity. The conversation ended a few minutes later, and as she lowered the phone, she found herself thinking about Ruth. About everything Ruth had seen long before anyone else. Especially her, the orphan nobody expected much from. The girl who had spent years feeling invisible. The girl everyone assumed received the lesser inheritance. How wrong they had all been, including Sadie, because the true gift had never been the farmhouse, and it had never been the archive. It wasn't even the legacy. The greatest gift Ruth left behind was belief. Belief in a little girl who couldn't yet believe in herself. Belief strong enough to survive death. Strong enough to guide her home. Later that night, Sadie walked through the archive one final time before bed. The shelves stood quietly beneath warm lamplight. The journals rested safely in their places. Generations of voices preserved, remembered, loved. At the center of the room hung a framed photograph. Ruth Bennett standing on the farmhouse porch decades earlier. Her smile calm and knowing, as though she had always understood how the story would end. Sadie stopped in front of the photograph, then whispered softly, "You were right." The room remained silent, but somehow she felt the answer anyway. Not in words. In peace. She touched the edge of the frame, smiled through her tears, and looked around the room that had changed her life. The house was no longer waiting. The stories were no longer hidden, and the little girl who once believed she was forgotten had become the guardian of something bigger than herself, something that would outlive them all. The farmhouse had been saved. The legacy had been preserved, and most importantly, so had she. Sometimes the greatest blessings don't look like blessings at first. When Ruth Bennett passed away, everyone thought Ethan had received the better inheritance. He got the money, the lake house, and the easy future. Sadie got the old farmhouse nobody wanted. But life has a funny way of revealing what truly matters. Money can make life comfortable. A purpose can make life meaningful. For years, Sadie believed she was the forgotten child, the girl nobody chose. But Ruth knew better. The farmhouse wasn't a reward. It was a responsibility, a chance to preserve stories, change lives, and finally discover where she belonged. In the end, the most valuable thing Ruth left behind wasn't property or money. It was the certainty that Sadie had been loved all along. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. Sometimes what feels like the smallest inheritance becomes the greatest gift of all. If you believe love is worth more than money, leave a comment below. And subscribe for more heartwarming stories that remind us what truly